Two of my top 25 favorite Real Monsters episodes. And as always, it's the final 10. At number 10, we have Cold Hard Toenails, in which we see Ickis, venturing himself into this house where there lives an old man, and he clips off a lot of toenails and puts them in a jar. And Ickis is convinced that they're all golden toenails that he can use, and a huge amount of wealth can be found with that. And therefore, he takes the jar of toenails, shows it to Crumb and Oblina, and they even have their own ideas of how wealthy they really are, and even how wealthy they want to be. But unfortunately, this whole idea of wealth has definitely gotten to Ickis's head, to the point where this strains his friendship between Crumb and Oblina. And then they continue to fight over it, and then they realize that it's just no use fighting over something silly like a jar of toenails. This was an episode that I watched ever since I was 8 years old, and one that I look back with such nostalgia. At number 9, we have Don't Just Do It, in which we see Grumble hosting a class with the monsters filling up their air sacs in order to breathe, and Ickis is picked as a test subject because he knows how to expand, and when Ickis expands alongside his air sac, he's instructed by the Grumble to put it back in, and unfortunately, he goes haywire, and Ickis is pretty much mocked on by the rest of the class. This leaves Ickis in such a funk that he's totally distraught about it, until he meets a rogue monster by the name of Foog alongside his gang members. And Foog constantly picks on Ickis, and Ickis tries to fight back, and he pretty much succeeds, to the point where Foog accepts him in his gang. So Ickis has a sort of new attitude, like slacking off and even going a bit bad. But we also realize that even Foog also is not really that well educated himself, and he's pretty much a rebel all his entire life. And even when Ickis and Foog are about to go up into the human world, Ickis double checks with Foog if he's filled his air sacs, and Foog reassures him that he's done it, and nonchalantly both of them go up and scare off the French cake chef, and then Foog thinks that he's won the battle, but he's out of breath, and the chef ends up coming back in to report that there are a couple of monsters that have destroyed his cake, and Foog doesn't have that much time to live. Ickis, remembering that he has a lot of air sacs being used, especially when it comes to 48 hours on Earth, remembers to bring Foog down, and Foog is totally grateful for Ickis for rescuing him, and even makes up for what he's done, and even gets accepted into the Grumbles class, albeit with detention and a session from the Snorch, and a lot more stuff that he has to clean up with. And even Ickis does get a session from the Snorch, but we get to know that at least Foog has found a really great friend in Ickis, and this was an episode that I kind of felt touched with, because I was almost expecting a straight up good character gone bad episode, but what we got was that there was a bad character that ended up going good after one of the main characters ended up saving his life. So it was a really nice twist to the ending that I really enjoyed. At number 8, we have Into the Woods, in which the Grumble gives Ickis an assignment that he has to do, scare more than just one human, but scare a group of human beings. Because as Grumble stated, according to the rules of scaring, human beings, when they're in a group, have a more sense of security, and they feel that together they can't really fear anything. So Ickis does show his first scare as he scares a huge crowd of babies, but that's not even enough for Grumble. So Ickis decides to visit Bradley once again, the same kid who we saw in previous episodes, and especially with his time with Simon the Monster Hunter. And what I really liked about this episode is just how great the bond is between Ickis and Bradley. Rarely do you see any moments where the monsters have any sort of friendship with any like human kids or even human beings in general. With this one, it's rather really interesting and rather sweet to see Ickis have a great friendship with Bradley, because with Bradley, he's an only child, and he always believes that there are always monsters on this earth, and how he decides that he could be friends with Ickis is just definitely awesome. And especially considering that, yes, Bradley is also a kid who doesn't even have that much friends or barely has any friends. Thus, he gets constantly being picked on by a lot of the other kids, mostly because he's different. Yeah, you could say that this is definitely a great example of not just the monsters getting some development, but also some of the human characters. And Bradley, though he's not anything that's deep or anything that is, well, revolutionary, he's just simply put a kid who has to go through, like, the certain stages and uncertainties of being a kid, and going to summer camp is one of them, and even trying to fit in with the other kids is also yet another challenge that he faces almost every day, especially when he tells a ghost story, and poor Ickis gets himself lost. He gets attacked by a bear, he attracts the attention of 3 lumberjacks, and he even comes back to Bradley. Bradley was wondering where on earth was he. The grizzly bear comes back, and Ickis decides that the best thing he should do is fight the bear back with his scares, thus leading the bear to run away. And, well, even Bradley showed that he was also brave enough himself too, thus telling the tale of how he managed to get over his fears with Mother Nature to his newfound friends, and even Ickis, well, having a great feedback from the Grumble and many of his colleagues that he can really scare a great group of human beings in the form of kids. And, well, they all want them to even tell their stories once again. So this episode was personally my favorite because it's really nice seeing the friendship between Bradley and Ickis really flourish. I do wish that Bradley could have been featured in a lot more episodes, because he was a pretty interesting character, and he was a very interesting mix to the show, because, you know, a lot of the human characters in Aaahh! Monsters are either vicious and, well, crazy like Simon the Monster Hunter, or just pretty much one note. With Bradley, we get to really see the very human side of what really makes his imagination really go wild, and still, even as a kid, he does see that there can be good moments, especially found in Ickis. And I really thought that the biggest highlight in this episode was just really the friendship between Bradley and Ickis. At number 7, we have Hats Off, in which, well, there is a magic show happening with a magician, and Ickis decides that the best thing he should do is just steal the magician's hat. Then we get a lot of hijinks ensue with Ickis and the magician's hat, as he is pulled in and sees a lot of rabbits, and even hailing Ickis as their new rabbit king. And then there comes a disjointed woman alongside a tiger driving a car by the name of Mittens the Tiger, and he's constantly chasing the rabbits every time he's on the car. And it's basically up to Ickis to put a stop to this. And the disjointed woman and the rabbits cheer for Ickis to the point where he becomes their king. And all the while, the magician ends up being booed on stage for not showing anything that's eye-popping. And then the disjointed lady then goes crazy, saying that this is where Ickis belongs for the rest of his life. And a lot of weird imagery occurs in the form of a sort of Alice in Wonderland chase scene, thus leading Ickis to wake up and finally tell himself it was just a dream, and thank goodness that Oblina ended up returning the magician's hat to the main magician himself. So overall, this episode really did have some very crazy moments and a lot of surreal moments, and definitely a scene that almost made me remind me of Alice in Wonderland, a lot of these LSD trips that one would watch or even one would witness. So overall, this episode really does live up to its, well, surreal nature, and just how awesome and just how fun it can really be, especially when it comes to messed up imagery with the lady like losing her lid, saying that she has to tell Ickis that he belongs in the hat and he should stay there as the king of the bunnies. And I thought that was just a messed up scene, but oh well, it's always the trope of beware the nice ones, as we did see that the lady was a really nice person. She doesn't mean to harm a fly until you see her flip side, in which you say, oh my goodness, she's losing it. But still, this episode was just a lot of fun. At number 6, we have Roshomonster, in which we have Ickis, Crumb, and Oblina tell their sides of the story of what happened at the opera house. And the biggest highlight in this episode is just hearing the first part of the third act of Die Valkyrie, the one where the Valkyries, well, call down Brunhilde, and then Brunhilde brings in Sieglinde. Sieglinde is very terrified and sad at first, and Brunhilde tells Sieglinde that, well, you have to have courage, you have to lose no hope because you're going to bear a son. And Sieglinde proceeds to sing the O herstes Wunder, and with the joy and prosperity that she's going to become a mother to the Redeemer of the world, Siegfried. And then we have Wotan coming in with his epic line of Steh Brunhild, with the Valkyries panicking. And of course, there were moments in which this line was replayed all throughout, but this is definitely a great trivia to be found in this episode, and it really does show that this does have a lot of moments of class, which I really enjoyed. And this was also the episode, or even one of the episodes, that has really made me appreciate opera a lot more. And, well, the episode doesn't really end well for Ickis, Crumb, and Oblina, as, well, when the machine is fixed, they find out that even though they've done a good job, they felt like they've mostly fabricated a lot of stuff, which leads to all three monsters cleaning up the Gromble's shoes. But still, the biggest highlight was definitely hearing an excerpt from Richard Wagner's third act of Die Valkyrie, and I thought it was just absolutely exciting, especially for someone who didn't really care about opera, but then to be introduced by this type of number was definitely a treat for me. At number 5, we have The Substitute, in which there is a substitute teacher by the name of Scritch, who comes in and seems to be very popular with the students, with the exception of Oblina, who is not so sure of what Scritch is hiding. He constantly has slime ball activities instead of formal lectures, and constantly makes a fool out of himself every time in lunch, and even the fact that he would sneak into the Grumble's office, with Oblina wondering what on earth is going on. And this leads to then having Crumb and Ickis being taken away by Scritch, to the point where Scritch fabricates something that their fathers had to take them away for a holiday or something like that. Oblina refuses to believe, and a chase scene occurs with Scritch and Oblina, to the point where Scritch outsmarts Oblina, and she falls into the sewer all the way up to the sea. And we even see that what happened with the Grumble, Ickis, and Crumb is that they ended up being kidnapped by Scritch himself. And, well, of how Grumble stated, it was mostly because, number one, it was just because of a rivalry that happened between Scritch and the Grumble. Scritch could not take any type of criticism, and Grumble was the one who constantly worked hard, Whereas with Scritch, according to Grumble, he was lazy, he was always finding the easy way, and he never gave in any effort of his own. He never applied himself as a person. But Scritch continues to blame the Grumble and even blame other people around him, other monsters around him, and say that it was not his fault and he is the one who constantly has to work hard. And, with the Scritch, I think it's kind of understandable what makes him a very interesting villain, but he just comes off as very much a petty villain who just wants power and just wants to be the talk of the town and wants all the spotlight, especially from the students. But the biggest highlight of this episode is when Oblina survives that circumstance that she went through and then proceeds to go totally ninja on Scritch, thus leading Oblina to say that her name is Oblina, and because Scritch always said that, he always stated that Oblina's name is Obloni. So this leads to the other monsters realizing that Scritch was definitely up to no good. He ends up being arrested and is now in solitary confinement. This episode was just a lot of fun, and it just leaves you hanging of what this character is going through and what's going on. Not to mention the epic fight scene between Oblina and Scritch, I thought was just well choreographed and very awesome. Sure, it could have been longer, but it probably would have maybe dragged the episode a lot longer. Still, it would have been really cool to see them fight a lot more and even have a lot of moves with each other. That would have been really cool. But still, the Substitute really deserves the number 5 spot on this list because of just how epic it is in its own special way, thanks to the battle between Scritch and Oblina. At number 4, we have a tie between Bigfoot Don't Fail Me Now and Loch Ness Mess. Now, I put these two together because these are two monsters, respectively Bigfoot, aka Alban, and the Loch Ness Monster, aka Loki, who have been, very chummy and have interesting histories with the Grumble. Interestingly enough, Alban was voiced by Arthur Burghardt of Network fame, and he was the one who did the role of the great Ahmed Khan, who was very well known for being the leader of this type of political gang by the name of the something in terms of ecumenical. I mean, it's been a long time since I watched the film. And we even have Loki, who was voiced by the late great character actor William Hootkins, who a lot of you people know him in his roles in Star Wars. So these two are on the list because when you think about it, there was a lot of star quality that can be found, especially with Arthur Burghardt's performance as Alban, giving off his gruff and very rough nature, and with William Hootkins giving the Loch Ness Monster his bombastic sense of entertainment and fun, and even just makes him very jolly and very enthusiastic. So let's start off with Bigfoot Don't Fail Me Now. Now, Simon the Monster Hunter is on the prowl once again, this time for the legendary Sasquatch, aka the Bigfoot. Now, the Bigfoot in question was actually a former student of the Grumble by the name of Alban, who was constantly being rebellious towards the Grumble because he refused to play by the rules, he refused to play by the book, and always did things his own way, usually getting himself into a lot of trouble with the forces of nature, and thus has to pretty much exile himself in the forest with an owl for company. In fact, the monsters would usually call the owl the hooty bird. Yeah, quite ridiculous, but at least it's pretty funny. So, Alban, after having the Grumble, Ickis, Crumb, and Oblina camp out for the night, just and he just basically ends up kidnapping the Grumble, mostly because, well, he just wants to get back what's his, and mostly just wants to prove the Grumble that maybe this Simon the Monster Hunter fellow would be very useful as another prisoner for him. And, well, let's face it, Alban gets captured, and the Grumble and Ickis, Crumb, and Oblina decide to help Alban out, and all is forgiven with Alban, and he is given an honorary doctorate of Monster Academy, and, well, he definitely has a great shining moment there. And then you have the Loch Ness mess, in which we have Loki visiting from Scotland to America and constantly being a pain in the butt to the Grumble, even though his, well, presence was welcomed, and because he was also a hero in his own country. However, the Grumble doesn't take too kindly with Loki's constant loudmouth nature and his constant bagpipe playing, to the point where, well, Grumble and Ickis, Crumb, and Oblina and the rest of the monsters decide to play in his game, like fight fire with fire, like give him loads of activities, and then what do you know? Everybody ends up falling asleep in the end. Unfortunately, with Loki's snake head, it tells him that he should have been the one telling Loki what to do. And I thought the ending was rather a head-scratcher, but still rather hilarious. So overall, these two episodes really had star quality written all over them, mostly because of Arthur Burkhart's stunning performance as Alban and William Hootkin's fun performance as Loki. So you should definitely check them out if you have the time. At number 3, we have the pilot episode, The Switching Hour, in which we have a young boy by the name of Nicky and his older brother Jake. Well, they pretty much live like a normal human family, and they're preparing for Halloween. Unfortunately, Nicky is constantly being tormented by Jake being the asshole older brother, and, well, Nicky being the sweet and very gentle younger brother. And then the Halloween season comes rolling with the monsters preparing for this very wonderful celebration. And, well, the Grumble forbids the monsters to go up the surface. And, well, let's just say that Oblina, Crumb, and Ickis sort of are rather interested to know what's it like up there. And, well, we get a very interesting turn of events as Nicky ends up being dressed up as Ickis, seeing that he was also fascinated by the creature. And thus leads to a madcap chase with Jake and his buddies egging houses, and even with Ickis and Nicky inadvertently switching places. Suddenly, Ickis becomes pretty much the talk of the town towards the kids, even though in his regular life he ends up getting himself in trouble in school, and, well, even though he knows how to fight back, and probably has gained a few friends here and there. And you even have the like of Jake and his buddies constantly tormenting Ickis, but Ickis can't take it anymore, so he decides to scare the crap out of Jake and his buddies. And, well, with Nicky, he does a pretty good job doing Ickis's part, to the point where when he gets called in, his minor scare to a cat was pretty much commendable by the Grumble, and even to a lot of the monster colleagues. And, well, even though Nicky and Ickis switch their places back, the Grumble is still wondering who on earth went up to the surface, until he finds out from a snitch monster that was actually Crumb, Ickis, and Oblina. At first, he decides to put punishment on them, but then he decides to say that they are the leaders of the monster universe, but unfortunately, they've disobeyed him, so now they have to face their punishment. And we don't know what their punishment really is. So overall, this episode really was a great starter to what was going to be a very awesome series. And this is definitely the way to kick it. At number 2, we have A Friend in Need, which is a very interesting episode because we have a monster that looks like a human, and even though Ickis does try to scare this quote-unquote human, he's then revealed to be a monster himself by the name of Blastug, who was once upon a time a very great colleague of the Grumble. And I'm starting to see a running pattern here. There are definitely moments in which there are some monsters that are also really associated with the Grumble, which is no surprise because he's pretty much the Monster Academy's most prestigious teacher. And, well, we do see that Blastug is a very down-to-earth and very mellow fellow. And, well, you could really see the relationship that Ickis and Blastug really have, especially with the Grumble. So, overall, this is definitely a very, very down-to-earth episode, and one that I really like, and one that I really remember to this very day. And every time I watch it, I can't help but feel a lot more nostalgic and have a little smile on my face, especially when it comes to Blastug. Why is he in not more episodes? I'll never know, because he was definitely a character that was, well, pretty much human and very much sympathetic as well, because, well, the thing about Blastug is that he uses his human disguise to blend in with humans before he can start scaring them, which makes him all the more interesting and very tactful as a character, and he really does use that tact really well. So I did get myself pretty caught off guard with this episode when I first saw it, but then when I think about who Blastug is as a person and as a monster, I can't help but root for him in this episode, because with him it is rather understandable of what he has to go through, and not to mention the heart-to-heart talk that he has with Ickis is actually pretty sweet, especially in a show like Real Monsters. I mean, it's a rare occurrence, but this episode really does shine in terms of how down-to-earth it can be. And now we have reached the final number on this list. The number 1 favorite episode of All Real Monsters, in my opinion, is Battle of the Century. Oh yes. This is the episode that had a lot of thrills, a lot of excitement, and just a lot of tension being taken into account in this episode. So once again, Simon the Monster Hunter has a plan in order to capture the monsters and make him a very well-known figure to the world. He has made himself a giant robot. And then we even see that the Grumble and all the monsters are totally concerned about this new happening and new plan from Simon the Monster Hunter. One day, Ickis comes late, and he's sent up to the human world to see what he's up to, and Ickis realizes that he's made a giant robot, but every time Simon pilots it, he seems to get himself into some deep shit, especially with a police officer who laughs at his driver's license, but gives him a fair warning. And then we get to the best scene in the entire episode. The fight scene between Simon the Monster Hunter's robot against Crumb's, Ickis's, Oblina's, and the Grumble's robot, which is basically a giant robot replica of the Grumble. Now, this episode really does remind me of a lot of the giant mecha anime that I like to watch, like Gundam Wing, Gundam Seed, and even when I was a teenager, Gurren Lagann, and at some point, Neon Genesis Evangelion. So we really get to see that there were some giant robot mecha anime influences implemented in this episode. You could really tell that the creators really did some of their research. Of course, it didn't contain the mega energy blasts that you see in a lot of mecha anime, but there were some interesting moves being used, like with Simon the Monster Hunter. We have the surprise move of the lava lamp, which hypnotizes the monsters, and even have Simon using perfume against the monsters, and even spraying them with detergent. Yeah, you could really see that this does work as a sort of homage to the mecha anime that a lot of people know and love. And this is definitely one that I really enjoyed and one that I had a lot of fun with. And that's why Battle of the Century is placed number 1 on my favorite Real Monsters countdown. And so I ask you this: what are your favorite episodes of Real Monsters? Please comment below and let me know. And until then, stay tuned for a tribute video dedicated to Real Monsters. So until then, see you later, everybody.